our wants exceed these scarce resources. So how do we limit that burden of scarcity? How do we avail ourselves, our community, and our country to more choices? We do this through trade. The only way in the history of the world we know to alleviate the burden of scarcity for everyone is through trade. Let me say this again. The only way that we all simultaneously get richer is through trade. Trade is a fundamental way to create wealth. As a matter of fact, we define poverty in economics as autarky, which is a fancy word for self-sufficiency, meaning a lack of trade. Specializing in trading is the only way we know to allocate scarce resources. Specializing in trading is the only way we know to alleviate scarcity. Scarcity implies 3 economic problems. These are: what do you produce, how do you produce it, and who gets these scarce resources? Without scarcity, we answer those 3 questions like this. What do you produce? You produce everything. How do you produce it? You produce it any way you want. And who gets these goods and services? Well, without scarcity, everybody does. But we do live in a world of scarcity, so there are some disagreement, and there will be disagreement, about how to answer those questions and how resources will be allocated. So we use the price system to arbitrate these things and disputes over issues with scarcity. We see that people are willing to pay the most for, and in economics, we call this revealed preference, what people are willing to pay the most for. It means where you put your money is actually what you want. It means that actions speak louder than words. Prices are a reflection of individual choices. They are signals about the opportunity cost of doing different things. Prices allocate resources to their highest and best use. They are a result of a constant communication and cooperation between consumers and producers. Producers are consistently being subjected to the profit and loss mechanism, which is a way that consumers alert them to whether or not they're being served. Producers receive profits when consumers are voluntarily purchasing their products, and producers incur losses when consumers have signaled that they don't want to purchase those goods and services at that price. The reason I'm going through these basic economic ideas with you is that so we can remember throughout this debate that prices are fundamentally the result of everybody's individual choices. Maybe we don't realize it, but everybody accepts the price system as a legitimate way to allocate resources and adjudicate disputes over resource allocation. We might go to a different gas station to get cheaper gas. We might wait till Black Friday to get a TV we've been eyeing, or we might be willing to pay more for an Uber when we are late for our flight. Because of these choices and the prices they produce, sellers attempt to produce things that satisfy our desires. It's the price system that is depersonalized and does not discriminate against anyone other than by their willingness to pay. The price of labor, which we call wages, works in the same way. Lower wages abroad tell us that those foreign workers are giving up less to produce goods and services than American workers. A worker's wages are a result of their productivity. There is no grand economic American plan to ship jobs to a specific country, to ship them to China, to ship them to another country. If jobs are moved overseas, it is the result of consumers' choices. Millions of consumers' choices, not a congressman, not a politician, and not a business person. This is the result of people revealing that they prefer relatively lower priced goods. Because trade is the source of all wealth, tariffs are taxes on goods and services that consumers would otherwise have liked to purchase. Tariffs are the result of the politically connected gaining from protectionism by the government. A tariff is fundamentally someone else disagreeing with your free choices to purchase what you want from whom you want. Tariffs are taxes on people who want to buy from the most productive producers. What does me advocating for free trade mean? It means that I am advocating for the free choices of all consumers, regardless of their political connections. It means that I am advocating for businesses who opt for lower cost avenues of production so they can stay competitive in our global economy, barring their political connections and their political resources. Being advocate for a free trade means advocating for the American consumer, not for what some technocrat or politician decides is a good use of Americans' taxpayer money and time. How do we know that Americans value Walmart, Google, and Meta? It's because these companies are some of the most valuable companies on the planet, and we know this because they have high profits. They have demonstrated that through voluntary exchange, people have elected to purchase the goods and services that they have to provide. And as a defender of free trade, I'm defending the freedom of Americans to use their money and spend their time in the best way they see fit. Being anti-free trade means being anti-Americans' choices. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Ferry. I'm going to take a slightly different point of view about trade. Let me start off by reminding you that in 1993, President Clinton signed the NAFTA free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. At the signing, he said, NAFTA means, quote, good-paying American jobs. Relying on economic modeling, Clinton said that NAFTA would deliver 200,000 additional jobs to the U.S. In that year, 1993, the U.S. had a $1.4 billion trade surplus in goods with Mexico. A surplus. We exported more to Mexico than they sold to us. Last year, 2021, the U.S. ran a $108 billion trade deficit with Mexico, meaning we imported $108 billion worth of goods more from Mexico than we sold to Mexico. Using the usual economist's rule of thumb that every $1 billion in the trade account is worth about 6,000 jobs, our trade with Mexico costs the U.S. about 6 million jobs annually. And Mexico is just one part of our trade position. Mexico is about 1/10 of our trade deficit. This year, our trade deficit is going to finish at about $1 trillion, which will be a record for the U.S. and in world history. We are importing some 4.5% of our gross domestic product and paying for it by putting our children and our grandchildren into debt. There's an old movie about gambling called Rounders, in which Matt Damon says, if you're playing in a poker game and a half an hour goes by and you still don't know who the sucker is in that game, then you are the sucker. I'm going to tell you some of the real economic principles that underlie international trade today, and when I finish, I think you're going to agree with me that in world trade today, the U.S. is the sucker. Free trade, also known as globalization, is actually a recipe for disaster for the U.S. It's for the pauperization of the lower half of U.S. households, for greater political polarization, and for the success of countries like China that are willing to exploit and break the rules at every single opportunity. From the 1980s until about 5 years ago, political leaders and economists continually hammered on the point that increasing global trade would benefit the U.S., usually through the so-called law of comparative advantage. Political leaders in the U.S. and abroad pursued the growth of trade, not the growth of people's incomes. But let me share with you 4 open secrets about globalization that economists do not like to discuss. First, globalization is regression to a global mean. It drives the wages and incomes of high-wage nations down, while it drives the wages and incomes of low-wage nations up. Secondly, some industries in the real world are more valuable than others because they deliver more advanced technology, faster growth, more investment, and crucially, higher incomes to their employees and prosperity to their communities. Third, our current trading system is almost designed to encourage surplus nations to exploit it at the cost of deficit nations. And fourth and finally, we face a national security threat and adversary in China, and it is exploiting our economic mismanagement and our gullibility every single day as it works to overtake us. Little more about each of those points. First, globalization is regression to a global mean. Last year, U.S. gross domestic product per person was $69,000. China's GDP per person was $13,000, and Mexico's was just $10,000. Globalization forces our workers to compete directly with Mexican and Chinese workers, driving U.S. wages down. That's why the average inflation-adjusted wage of a U.S. auto worker has fallen by 21% since the year 2000. Remember, 64% of American adults do not have a four-year college degree. Those are the ones who are competing with foreign manufacturers of cars, machinery, and electronics. Second, some industries are more valuable than others. Technology industries pay six-figure sums even to their new young employees. The steel industry today pays six-figure sums to its average worker, more than double the income those same people can earn from other employers in those regions. If we continue to participate in the so-called free trade system, which is not free at all, but I'm using that term because we all understand the term, if we participate in that system and we allow China to target, to choose, and then to dominate all the most valuable and strategic industries, we end up with the leftover industries and with a growing number of people working in low-wage service jobs like retail and restaurant service. Third, if a nation persists in running a large trade deficit, that means it is consuming more than it's producing. The only way a nation can get rich over time is to increase its production consistently over many years. That's exactly what the U.S. did in our golden century of growth from 1870 to 1970. If a nation runs a large trade surplus, as China and Germany do today, it is growing its own economy at the expense of others. The deficit nations like the US and the UK are the ones that Matt Damon would call the suckers at the poker table. Finally, China. China now dominates global production of steel, aluminum, laptop computers, smartphones, renewable energy equipment, pharmaceutical ingredients, and I could go on and on. If there is a global confrontation over Taiwan or over any other issue, and we stop and selling the small amount of things we sell to China and China stops selling to us, we are going to feel the pain immediately, not just in the civilian sector, not just in the medical sector, but in the military sector as well. You can't put an F-35 into the air today without rare earth materials in the magnets, in the motors that come only from China. This won't be pretty. So, in conclusion, what I'd like to say as an economist, I'd like to remind you, nations get rich through domestic growth, domestic investment, and allowing the right industries to flourish and grow, including each industry's entire supply chain. We must trade, but we must do it in a way that allows us to rebuild our industrial base, raise the wages of all our workers, and keep us in the technological lead, not just in R&D, but in manufacturing too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff and Julia. I have a set of targeted questions I want to ask both of you, and in the spirit of this being a civil debate, you're also welcome to sort of have a back and forth if there's a specific answer to an answer you want to give. But I want to start by asking a question that I'd love to get answers from both our participants on, which is, over the course of the past decade, have your views on free trade and U.S. trade policy more broadly changed? And if so, how and why? And if not, amid the sort of rising salience of trade policy, why haven't they? We'll start with the affirmative, I guess.
Have my views on trade policy changed recently? Not quite. If you will allow me, Nate, I'm going to respond to a few things that Jeff brought up, if that's okay. Just want to address the audience and my wonderful opponent here. Last time I engaged in a voluntary transaction, I did not consider myself a sucker. Trading with someone internationally is a win-win situation. That's why we do it. Absolutely, by no means. Are any of us wearing 100% American-made clothing? I very much challenge yourself to look at the tag on the back of your jacket or look at the bottom of your shoe. It is absolutely, most likely, purchased from an international source. So we are definitely not suckers when it comes to purchasing things abroad. Also, Jeff made the point that domestic or wealth comes from domestic production, and this just could not be more further from the truth economically. If this were the case, Russia would be thanking us for our sanctions, saying, thank you very much for preventing us from trading with the rest of the world. We are now going to focus on ourselves, especially in wartime. This is an amazing time to look inward. We are going to be focusing our domestic industry. But in fact, Jeff knows that free trade is an element to wealth and to robustness and to the ability to fight a war. So what we are doing strategically as the United States is we are sanctioning Russia. We know that that's going to give a huge economic blow to them. So Jeff cannot simultaneously hold the view that free trade is beneficial in some senses and not in other senses. To answer your question a little bit more specifically, Nate, I maybe have not changed my views of being like more pro-free trade or not, but I very much want to be pro-individuals and pro-wealth creation. And how I measure wealth and how most serious economists are measuring wealth is by consumer choices, not by production.
So I have a follow-up question about something you said, but Jeff, go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me okay? My mic is on?
I think so.
I'll start by answering the question. I've got more experience, I think, of life than Julia, so...
Jeff's already reverting to some ad hominems right off the bat.
Not at all.
Thank you for helping me make my case,
I
Jeff.
didn't mean it that way at all. What I was going to say, and I will say, is that I believed in free trade as well when I was a student, an undergraduate and a graduate student, and teaching economics. I went into the technology industry. I worked for a company called Nortel, which is now out of business. It was the largest maker of optical networking equipment in the world. In about 1998, we had a policy decision to outsource and offshore all of our manufacturing, which ultimately meant that 40,000 people were going to lose their jobs. I spoke to a lot of people in the company about this because I happen to be one of the few people with an economics background in this little team that was planning the offshoring proposition. And I spoke to people who'd been to Thailand and Malaysia where they were now going to make the equipment that Nortel was making in the US and Canada. And I said, you know, in economic theory, these people must be a tenth as productive as Americans because we're paying our workers 10 times as much as we're paying people in Thailand and Malaysia to make those same products. And the manufacturing executives came back and said to me, Jeff, not at all. You'd be amazed at how grateful these Thais and Malays are to have these jobs. They work super hard. They are great workers. And I thought to myself, how can it be that, I mean, and Julia mentioned a point which all of us economists teach, which is that a worker's wage is related to his or her marginal productivity or average productivity. A Thai worker earns a tenth of what a US worker earns, and yet the productivity is the same. How can that be? And the reason is that the economic theory that all of us teach in schools is not applicable to the real world. And it was at that point that I began to question free trade theory, and I ultimately realized that the way the US got rich was through industries that are the right industries that grow rapidly and through a limited population. So when we went through our history, and the automobile is the most outstanding example, but so is the networking equipment that Nortel made and today Cisco makes, and it's all made in Asia. But 30 years ago, it was made here, and it was highly profitable equipment. These were growth industries. They were raising American wages, and when you think of why America won the Second World War, why it was able to build more military equipment than any other country in the world, it was because we had those industries here and they were hugely productive and profitable. And so that period between 1995 and 2005 is when I changed my views from being a free trader, standard economist, to being somebody who looked at the world as these are different nations competing to get the right industries and competing for economic growth. And there are winners in that battle, and I know Britain was a winner in that battle until it was overtaken by the United States, and the United States was a winner in that battle, certainly from 1870 to 1970, and in the last 20 or 30 years, I'm deeply concerned about whether we're becoming a loser in that battle because of bad economic policies.
So this is great, because I wanted to start with a couple sort of zoomed out macro level theory questions and then kind of sort of hammer into the sort of like more in-depth and policy specific. By the way, my background is not in economics, so this is, you know, I've the sort of a undergraduate level understanding of economics, which is why I have too much more intelligent participants on this panel. But Julia, one thing that I heard you talk about a lot, both in your initial opening statement and your answer, was about individual choices and about the fact that one of the defenses of free trade in the trade debates is the fact that what you're essentially just doing is letting individual consumers make their own choices on the markets, and you know, who are we to tell individual consumers not to choose to do what they want to do? Do you think that there is a substantive difference or an important difference in the context of these debates between the choices of individual consumers in the American context and the cumulative effect of those choices in the national context? Because I think one of the arguments at the level of theory from critics of free trade, particularly as these critiques have manifested in the last few years, is that you have to think about trade policy in terms of, you know, whether it's national security or, you know, the broad-based economic prosperity. You pick your, you know, take your pick at a higher than just individual level. You have to think of it in terms of what's good for America. And sometimes the cumulative effects, call it market failure, call it anything else, of consumer choices in a globalized context could be maybe good for each individual consumer in the moment, but actually redound to sort of negative consequences for America as a whole.
Nate, I think you bring up a really good point. And we need to, as Jeff is very much encouraging us to do, look at the real world, and I would definitely disagree with him that trade theory about economics is wrong. Very much, it's alive and well with us, and we are definitely benefiting from it while we speak. But to your point, what are you implying, and what are folks that advocate for tariffs and anti-free trade policies advocating for? They are advocating for a set of experts, technocrats, government bureaucrats, whoever it is, to determine that policy. Now, I very much challenge you and want to inform you that that is subject to political posturing. It's very much susceptible to the political process. For those of you who are not aware, trade is governed by, tariffs are governed by the harmonized trade schedule. And this is an over 4,000-page document telling you what kind of tariffs are on certain products. There is a different tariff depending on whether or not you're importing a 100% cotton shirt or a 50% nylon shirt. There are tariffs on peanuts, whether they are shelled or unshelled. There is a over 300% tariff on tobacco. The government experts who we are relying to make this decision of what's best for America is simultaneously taxing imports of tobacco and also having events telling individuals not to smoke. They're also putting taxes on cigarettes. So what you are implying is that there's this benevolent force that speaks for America. Only individuals make decisions. That's either a consumer, a producer, or a government bureaucrat, an elected politician. And my point with all these things is these are subject to public choice policy. They are subject to problems of incentives that face the politician. We just had an election last night, and I want you to ask yourselves, regardless of what side are you on, do we trust these people who were elected to determine now what free trade policy is? Because that's what advocates of tariffs are advocating for. We need to put this decision in somebody else's hands other than the consumer. What's amazing about the consumer-producer relationship is that it is a win-win, and the consumer is signaling, I very much get value from this product by what's called revealed preference, by purchasing this. So, Nate, to answer your question, No, I don't. I mean, if we talk about America, it is made up of us. It is made up of our individual decisions. And I would very much respectfully disagree with Jeff. And America did not become wealthy because of its protectionist of domestic industries. It became wealthy because we are economically free. We are economically and civilly free relative to many other nations. And I want to be an advocate for those free decisions.
So one quick follow-up, just about the last couple sentences. Does that extend to, say, Chinese influence in America? I mean, one of the contentious issues, particularly in the last couple of years, is Chinese companies or Chinese-backed companies buying up American farmland, sort of a variety of sort of vaguely CCP-associated corporations extending their tentacles further into the United States. Mm-hmm. And that, if you take a sort of absolutist free trade position, would be entirely legitimate. But some people would argue that, or the critics of free trade would argue that it exposes a sort of a problem or a weakness with the sort of pure consumerist view of what America is, because America does actually have national interests that aren't always completely concomitant with pure free trade. Is that something you'd be comfortable with? Do you think it's an issue?
So as far as Chinese investment into America?
Right, and what that sort of says about the sort of the theory that you're talking about in terms of free trade.
Okay, so with regards to China, I would advocate the fact that in order to reduce the probability of conflict with them, we want to make our economy so intertwined with them that it is a huge mistake for them to get involved with us militarily. The best way to promote peace and prosperity is to align incentives, and that is through prosperous free trade. Now, China is very much maligned for not following these rules, and I think that's what you're referencing. And the World Trade Organization puts up rules and suggestions for countries to follow. Don't be involved in what they call dumping. Don't be involved with retaliatory tariffs and whatnot. Now, China has definitely broken those rules. But guess who else has broken a lot of those rules? The United States, namely the Trump administration, just within the past few years. Some scholars actually say that the United States has broken free trade rules more than any other nation on the planet. So I just want to point out that we are not this benevolent actor, and maybe by we I mean the United States government, but we are not a benevolent actor. Now, what does China subsidizing its industries, purchasing things here? If they're investing in our economy, great. What does that mean? It means that they are invested in us. They put their money in our economy. They are trusting. Now we are incentive aligned. They don't want the country to tank. And what's great about a non-zero-sum game, which we are playing, right? We don't necessarily have to see China as adversarial. We are both benefiting from their free trade. Free trade and liberalization of their markets arguably brought almost 1 billion people out of poverty in the past few decades in China, which is a really amazing thing. If China would like to subsidize its local industries, that is going to unfortunately hurt Chinese consumers and bolster those domestic industries. It also is going to regrettably hurt American industries that are trying to compete with those Chinese industries. Perhaps and hopefully they're going to be doing something more economically efficient with what they're doing, but it very much helps American consumers. So I do not see this contentious relationship like we win, they lose situation. The past many decades have shown that both of us are winning.
So I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about China, since you can't talk about trade debates without talking about China. But Jeff, I wanted to, a point that Julia made in her opening statement, and the flip side of the sort of conversation of how, especially on the right, within conservatism, where I think that the trade debate is particularly contentious, the advocates of a more sort of protectionist or more sort of trade skeptical position often sort of style themselves as populists. One of the fundamental criticisms is that the free trade regime of the sort of late 90s, early 2000s left behind a segment of American workers. It redounded to the benefit of Silicon Valley, elites, but you hollowed out the manufacturing sector, et cetera. But the flip side of that is that, to Julia's point, one of the arguments from advocates of free trade, or at least critics of tariffs and protectionism, is that it A, empowers bureaucrats, empowers government planners, but B, also often empowers the politically connected and the special interest groups that have one-stop shops on K Street or something like that, right? So the argument is that you actually have a more sort of egalitarian economic regime where everyone's playing by the same rules within the context of a liberal trade regime, rather than one in which the control over imports and exports is disproportionately governed by government bureaucrats, and those bureaucrats are often, almost always, party to the influence of special interests that have a lot of money and political influence. What do you make of that critique?
Well, I guess I would say two things. Well, a couple of things. First, I agree that there's always a danger of special interests taking over policies, taking over industries, and as you implement policies that support national economic growth, you need to pay attention to maintaining competition at home. A great example of that is in 2018, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on imports of steel, 25% tariffs. In 2018, steel prices rose. In 2019, they fell below the level before the steel tariffs were imposed. Why is that? That's because we've got several world-class steel companies in this country, and when they saw the tariffs were being imposed and the global surplus of steel created by China was being kept out, they all began building steel mills, and they became more aggressive to win the business in the United States. Imports fell, steel prices fell, more investment in steel and in high-quality steel and next-generation high-tech steel, more guys and women getting jobs that pay, as I said before, six-figure sums. Because if you look at the statements from the leaders in the steel industry, Nucor and Steel Dynamics, those companies are paying six-figure sums. So you need to maintain competition. Of course, you need to fight against special interests and bureaucrats. Let me add one other point. For those of you who who are interested in economics, the world economy and the national economy is a system. When Julia talks about consumer choice governing what producers do, there are many, many assumptions built into that system. One of the international assumptions is that no country can run a persistent trade deficit or trade surplus. This goes back to David Hume in the 1760s, and it was observed that if you run a deficit, gold leaves your country, prices fall, and you export more, and then you get back to zero. Every economist that I know supports that idea. Every country should, in the long run, we use fancy terms, we might call it a current accounts balance rather than a current account surplus, and we might say we should make an allowance for FDI, foreign direct investment, but the point is, in the long term, your account should tend towards balance. In fact, what we observe is not that. We observe the opposite. The U.S. has run a trade deficit for 45 consecutive years. Nobody in the history of the world has ever done that, although one scholar has said ancient Rome did the equivalent in the years leading up to the collapse of the Roman Empire. China has run a trade surplus for about 30 years, and its surplus tends to be the mirror image of our deficit. If you allow a system that lets us run a continuous deficit, it means foreigners are selling more goods into here, hollowing out our industries. The law of comparative advantage, which those of you who've studied economics should understand, does not apply if a country runs a persistent deficit. It means it can have a disadvantage in everything. And with a dollar that is 30% overvalued and $1 trillion trade deficit this year, I would say to you that everybody, virtually every industry in America that competes with foreign imports is at a competitive disadvantage because of that huge overvaluation in the dollar.
So one follow-up question to that, insofar as we're talking about economic theory, Adam Smith, I think, disagreed with you. I mean, one of his arguments, I have this, a bunch of different Adam Smith quotes written down, but one of the arguments he made in Wealth of Nations was, nothing, however, can be more absurd than this whole doctrine of the balance of trade. So what do you think Adam Smith got wrong insofar as it sounds like you're advocating the exact opposite of what he's saying?
I would have to see the entire passage. I do know that Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations says quite clearly that where military and national security interests are concerned,
a nation should support the industries and that support national security, and if necessary, use tariffs and export bounties, in other words, subsidize exports. But Adam Smith says a lot of things, and I'll come back to you, Nate, after this interview on that one.
Totally fine. I'm not going to spring too many Adam Smith quotes on both of you guys. But I do think, well, I'll ask you one more question, Jeff, and then I've got a couple questions for Julia. Why do you think, it seems to me that the debate over trade is much more contentious right now on the American right than it is on the American left? Why do you think that is, if you see the premise?
I think because the American left is very busy talking to itself and talking to its own upper middle class constituency instead of talking to the public. And I think the American right, people like Donald Trump saw an opportunity. And I grew up in New York City, and Donald Trump was active in New York back in the days when we saw Japan, thank you, taking our best industries. And the opportunity they saw was there for the taking. And I think the best example is back in those days, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, machine tool manufacturers, we don't have a machine tool industry scarcely anymore, and steel workers were losing jobs by the bucket load, and the economists and the politicians of both parties were going and saying, this is good, everybody gains from free trade. Don't worry, we all gain. And I think that is literally adding insult to injury to tell a steel worker who's lost a job and is trying to support his family either on welfare or by working in retail, that everybody gains when he can look at Youngstown, Ohio, and see the depression that's going on. And these guys said, we're no longer going to vote for these clowns who've been telling us for years now that everybody gains from free trade. And so you had, you refer to them as populists, which I think is a fine term. Donald Trump. I mean, I'm very happy that in Ohio we just had an election with two people you'd call populists, right? And J.D. Vance narrowly beat Tim Ryan. At CPA, we have great relationships with Tim Ryan because he's been there a long time. J.D. Vance is a newcomer, and I expect we'll have good relations with him because he's in favor of tariffs, and he's telling the folks in Ohio, look, you don't gain if we let China make everything and you guys all go work in Walmart, 16 hours a week at minimum wage. So that's how I see it. I'm sure Julia disagrees.
I was going to say, before asking more questions, I want to give you space if you wanted to reply to any of that. I can also ask another question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Something that is central to this discussion is fundamentally understanding what we mean by this trade deficit. What this literally is exports minus imports. Let's go back to the very basics. You have a trade deficit with your grocery store. You have a trade deficit with where you buy your clothing. Your employer has a trade deficit with you because they're giving you a lot more money than you are giving them. I'm not sure what economists Jeff is talking to, but I very much respectfully disagree that everyone needs to have this balance of trade. A deficit is a scary word that is meant to scare you from the fact that various nations, which the fundamental principle is the same situation. Is Wisconsin fearful for having a trade deficit with Michigan or Ohio? We don't even think about those things unless we build this arbitrary national boundary. So another word for a trade deficit, as Jeff referred to, is a current account surplus. What this means is foreigners having our money. They do typically one of two things with that. They either purchase our goods, which is going to be an export of ours, which is going to more balance trade, if you will, or they're going to invest in the United States. This is a very much good thing. So this boogeyman of this trade deficit is not reflective of prosperity. Purchasing goods and services is instrumental in driving wealth for individuals. So Jeff is drawing this picture of, look at this huge deficit. I would like you to look at, he was citing, as far as I know, and please don't let me misquote you, but in the past 40 years, the United States has had a trade deficit.
Every single year. Every
single year. Does that mean we're just about to nosedive into the ground with our economy? We are still an enormous economy. We're extremely, extremely, extremely prosperous. And up until fairly recently have been doing very well. So this trade deficit boogeyman is not relevant to our prosperity. Something else that I want to indicate is let's note and let's let prices drive what we call high productivity, high paying jobs. There is nostalgia around steel. There is nostalgia around agriculture. There is nostalgia around these various things. It's sad when someone loses a job. But what does that mean? What if we impose this protectionism 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? We would be protecting industries that would be laughably inefficient today. So my point is, let's let the price mechanism alert us to the best, biggest industries. And those are going to be our tech companies. That is where the United States producer and the United States worker has a comparative advantage in. And let's just note Walmart. It was the #1 revenue company just this past year. What does that mean? It means that people say, thank you, Walmart, for the goods and services that you are providing for me. Here is my money. That is an incredible thing. These industries, we might not like them. We might have nostalgia for other ones, but the manufacturing sector in the United States is around 11%. We have our services industry of around 77 and upwards %. Why are we not more focused on them? Because they are the ones driving our economic prosperity.
Follow-up question to that, Juliet. You were talking about the fact that if we had this sort of protectionist approach a century ago, we'd be protecting all these industries that would be totally irrelevant now. Do you think there are any industries in America today that the American nation, and by extension, the government, actually does have some sort of vested interest in protecting, even via some sort of trade interventions if necessary?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Nate. So in short, no. And here is an answer to that. Many say we need to protect certain things for national security. Now, I want to challenge you just to think in the past year or two what things have been called a national security threat. Cyber national security threats. We have chip threats. We have physical threats. So how is some bureaucrat who knows nothing about cybersecurity threat, or may even be the foremost expert in cybersecurity threat, going to know exactly what industry and exactly what points in the supply chain to say, we need to protect this exact thing? Let's let the market indicate to us what is essential for national security, and if we are not efficient in purchasing that, let's stockpile it. Let's stockpile it, because protecting that industry is fundamentally retarding growth of that industry, making it weaker, making it less robust to national defense. Let's think about steel. Less than 3% of American steel is actually used for national defense, and the vast majority of steel that we import are from friendly partners, Canada, Brazil, and Mexico.
So I think we only have time for one or two more questions from me, and then we'll outsource it to the audience. But Jeff, I want to ask you the...
Nate, you're outsourcing it to the audience. Are we okay with that?
Well, that's up for you guys to decide. It's not, I'm just the moderator. I'm a neutral.
Yeah, outsourcing to the audience, right? We might want to protect your job, Nate.
Poor choice of words. Poor choice of words.
Seems like they're taking away your job.
So, but in all seriousness, Jeff, the flip side of what I was just asking is, do you think that protectionism and tariffing can go too far? In terms of, I don't take you to be arguing for pure autarky, right?
Right.
So what would the limits be of a more sort of protectionist market economy in the US, and what specifically would that look like?
Yeah, I don't like the word protectionist because it sounds sort of defensive and negative. What I think about are growth strategies. What I think about day and night is that between 1870 and 1970, this economy grew at 3.5% per year per person for 100 years. Unknown in world history. That's what made us the richest nation in the world. That's why in the Second World War, we built the military equipment for the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, and China. All of that came from these 48 states at that time. Okay, and that was 3.5% growth. Since the year 2000, we've struggled to get to 1% growth per year. And I ask myself why. And one of the reasons is this god-awful, stupid globalization, which has allowed us to transfer the growth potential to China. I mean, Julia's right that a lot of people escape from poverty in China, but China is a communist dictatorship, and it has a long-term goal which is not friendly to the United States. So as an economist, why do I want to see all that growth go there? Particularly because it is reducing the incomes of the bottom half of our population. So yes, there's a limit to the amount of tariffs. I mean, today we import $3 trillion worth of goods and we export $2 trillion. We need to do 2 and 2. We need to cut imports by a third and continue to be the world's biggest importer. And there are all kinds of things we should be importing from other countries, various fruits and vegetables. Italians make nice suits, why not? I'm in favor of all that stuff. What we need to focus on, though, is not the level of tariffs, which might be on the order of, and we're trying to study it and to estimate it, and on many industries it might be somewhere between 25 and 40%. And you'd say, does that raise prices? And what I'd say to you is that creates thousands and millions of jobs in industries that pay very well and let Americans buy more things, not less, and let us grow fast again and rebuild our national security. So that's how I think of the problem.
Beautiful. All right, we'll open up to the audience now. I'll stop talking.
So there's a mic over here, there's a mic over there, which I'll turn on in just a second, but if you've got a question, come on up and ask your question. And I just ask that people be brief so we can get to a lot of questions.
There needs to be a real question mark at the end of your question, not just a statement.
So quick question, thanks a lot, appreciate everything so far. Quick question on the different motivations. So the motivation of government is to protect us. And I think one of the things we saw at COVID is that if we have to rely on China and other countries for medical devices, things like that, that could be a significant problem. So if we assume that having a free and fair trade is a good thing, how do we at the same time take into considerations these security threats from relying too much on somebody who may not have our interests at heart?
I would very much disagree with the premise of that question, which is the government's role is to protect us. For this crowd, let's just ask ourselves, how effective has that been just in the past few years? Now, our own government doesn't know how to quote unquote protect us, much less protect us from foreign threats. But I very much, Jeff had mentioned that special interests, having these type of carve-outs for specific industries leaves the door open to special interests. And Jeff, not to call you out, but in his blog,
Sort of your job.
yes, Jeff,
Cool, a little bit.
he is an advocate of protection of the bicycle industry. Now, Jeff happens to be an avid bicyclist. What does this mean? It means that anybody who is wanting to advocate for these things, I love these flashy suits from Veronica Beard. Now am I, if I'm in a position of power, going to protect this industry completely arbitrarily? So to answer your question, this is just opened up to completely arbitrary designation by government officials. Please, I very much encourage everybody to look at the harmonized trade schedule. This has tariffs on everything under the sun. Walnuts, gin, sneakers, French chocolate. What does that have to do with security? What does that have to do with protection of various industries that are essential to our nation? I would be willing to bet if you need evidence that there is political posturing in our tariff situation, just look at the over 4,000 pages that designate what goods and services have tariff protections.
Jeff, should there be tariffs on French chocolate?
No, because I don't think we can make chocolate here, right? Because the cocoa beans come from Africa. But since Julia raised bicycles and is trying to suggest that I have a personal vested interest in bicycles, I guess I do. I own several, but not a single one of them is made in the United States. But what I would say is that what I know from my friend who owns a bicycle company is the following. Back when he started in the bicycle business in the 1980s, they made bicycles in Brooklyn. They assembled bicycles in Brooklyn. Kids, or young people out of high school got a good job making bicycles and welding bicycles. Today, those jobs don't exist. And the decline of manufacturing in the inner city is part of the reason why we see so much crime in the inner city. Why don't those jobs exist? In the 1990s, China, having decided that it needed to dominate the world's steel industry, it said, my God, we're now making so much steel, nobody's going to buy this crap, partly because they make it in a very dirty and low-quality way. And what are we going to do? And they said, oh, well, bicycles is one way to get rid of some steel. They began a policy that said, if you build a bicycle factory, we will give you the land for free. Chinese entrepreneurs said, we don't know anything about bicycles, but we know that this land is going to be worth a lot one day. And so you had literally millions of bicycles began to be manufactured in China and shipped, of course, to the United States because, as Matt Damon says, we are the world's #1 sucker. All of our bicycle manufacturing businesses, except my friends that were volume manufacturers, not my friend, my colleague in CPA, and we're trying to get him to rebuild his factory. All the others went out of business, moved all their manufacturing to Asia, mostly to China. And so we lost this industry here at home. Europe did something different. Europe levied tariffs that ranged between 30% and 90% on Chinese bicycles. Today, there are about 500 bicycle companies in Europe making bikes and e-bikes. There are about 50,000 people working in the bike industry, and these are good job opportunities. Europe did the right thing, and the judgment I use, you're right that bureaucrats left on their own would do the wrong thing. We need an objective judgment. The objective standard is, are workers making good money in these jobs, and are these companies thriving? My friend Arnold's bike factory in South Carolina employs 200 people in South Carolina. Most of them are high school graduates, if that. Many of them are African American. He's paying them a good wage for where they are. He's giving them health benefits. He took care of them right through COVID. We want to reshore bikes so he can double the size of his factory. That's what we're all about.
Jeff, with all due respect, he has given himself as an example for that his revealed preference is actually in the case of this international trade. Jeff, if you are an advocate of American bikes, why don't you have an American bike? Presumably because you have said, this international bike that I am purchasing is more beneficial to me. So what you are saying by advocating for various tariffs is taking those decisions from other people. And that is not how I would like to advocate for the economy.
Julia, we are not just 300 million consumers in a world of 7 billion consumers running around like little molecules in an economic module.
And definitely not what I implied.
Sorry?
And definitely not what I implied. Completely agree.
Let me finish. We are a nation, the United States, and our government, which does many things wrong and some things right, as I said, up till 1970, delivered world-leading prosperity for some specific reasons and specific policies, some of which they stumbled into. But the government has that responsibility, and simply to say, we're all just consumers, and if the Chinese are willing to make a crap bike for $50 that your son or daughter is going to fall off and break his head on, and if you are the sort of libertarian who says there should be no Consumer Product Safety Commission as well, that's
I never said that.
No, well, I mean, you're obviously of the libertarian persuasion, I would say, and I think that it's clear to me, and I think it's clear to some of the people in the audience, that that can go too far. I mean, Milton Friedman, when he was alive, he did a lot of good economics. He also said there should be no licensing requirement for any profession, including surgeons. However, if you read about Milton Friedman's illnesses as he got older, he didn't go to some South American country where you can find a surgeon without a license and save 30%. We've got to have a government that imposes some rules to help this country get more prosperous, take care of those who can't take care of themselves, create opportunity for those at the top so that they're not completely overwhelmed by China, as my company was when we were in the technology industry and fighting against Huawei.
So we'll move on to the audience really quickly, but I just want to ask you, Julia, because I think this brings up what we were talking about earlier. Do you believe that there is such a thing as a national interest? And if so, do you believe that there are different countries with dueling national interests that don't always align?
To an extent, but because of the public choice problems I brought up, they are going to be extremely susceptible to special interest, which we said my wonderful opponent has even fallen into. And I think we could think about a whole bunch of other industries that we could make an argument, just like he did with bicycles, to talk about how vital they are to his economy. Something I want to note as well, and it answers your question to some extent, but jobs are not in and of themselves essential. Jobs, we can end unemployment tomorrow. Let's take away everybody's laptop and have everyone write things on pen and paper. High-paying jobs are determined by the market. Jeff keeps referencing manufacturing and whatnot. This is an American economy of bygones past. Almost 80% of our economy is tech. We want to talk about the future. We want to talk about where we're going. How do we promote those industries? If somebody else can do manufacturing more efficiently than us, great. Where are the high-paying jobs? They're in places where we have a comparative advantage, which is primarily in technology, which is shown by the fact that these companies are making incredible products that we use every day. So jobs in and of themselves are not an ends. They are something that should be guided by the price mechanism and not just created out of whole cloth. I could have a job created by Pepperdine University of me talking to an empty room every single day. But I would like to promote an economy that has jobs that are driven by productivity and demand. Those are not jobs that are indicated by a government bureaucrat saying, we're going to give special protection to this industry, which my wonderful opponent is advocating for.
Okay, we'll move on. Sir.
Sure. Good evening, and my question is for both of you. So after the manufacturing industry largely left the Midwest, the Rust Belt, over the past 40 to 50 years, we've seen a large increase of deaths of despair with drug overdoses, alcoholism, and poverty increasing across the region. And we see that a lot of these companies in this region provided a good social fabric for these communities. So my question is, are the better macroeconomic trends worth the social cost of outsourcing?
Jeff.
I think you're absolutely right that that this has been a severe wrong turn for our economy over the last 30 or so years. And as you say, the problems we've seen in the entire manufacturing region are serious. Deaths of despair is one example. You know, economist studies have even found that in areas where you've had high Chinese import penetration, you've had a lower marriage rate because women decide it's not worth marrying a man who's got a part-time job at a retail establishment. I mean, the problem is we have 200 million people who want to work in this country. The average IQ of the average American is 100 by definition. Google, I mean, Julia talks about tech companies. When I lived in Silicon Valley, we made optical networking equipment and we sold it to Google, and I was at Google at one of their 27 cafeterias, including Japanese sushi and Thai food and all the rest of it, and I met many Google executives, and it's a great company, but they say themselves they take the top 2% of those who apply for jobs. And the only people who apply for jobs are people who understand computer software, search algorithms, and in our case, what we did was build their networks that would carry these enormous volumes of traffic. Google cannot employ Google and the entire software industry and the entire internet industry cannot employ the 200 million Americans who want jobs. We need jobs that the ordinary American can do, and people do need jobs because they do want to raise a family, and I'm actually in favor of jobs, and I'm in favor of families, and I'm in favor of people working after they get out of school and, you know, have some ambition and some opportunity. And I'll tell you, a well-run manufacturing company offers that opportunity for growth and maturity that you don't get in a retail establishment that is all full of part-time workers or a restaurant. I think we all know that. And, you know, you can't take, you know, and you know, I agree up to a point that there's price and there's revealed preference and people want cheap stuff. But we are a nation and we have to provide for those people, because if we don't, the problems you're alluding to, deaths of despair, broken homes, you know, drugs, and men sitting at home on the sofa playing video games 8 hours a day. You know, the truth is women respond much better to no job opportunities than men. Women find things to do, they take care of members of their family, they join voluntary organizations. There's a marvelous book called Men Without Work, which I recommend to everybody. Everstat's the author, about how men respond to this situation differently. They sit at home, they play video games, some of them get involved with drugs, sadly. We as a society need to be conscious of those issues.
To answer your question, at what cost? Think about 200 years ago. If we were to say, hey, we would like to protect all these metallurgy jobs and all of these jobs that are surrounding basic carriages, because these give these people dignity. Let's say the government was protecting these jobs. What is going to lead to more despair? Working in an industry that you had no demand for, that's me lecturing to a room of empty individuals. Or in the short run, allowing those concentrated costs to provide dispersed benefits to the community. It is not incumbent for us as a country to promote industries that do not have demand. And that is what those industries are indicating. Now, I bring up this protecting infant industries of things of the past as something that would be laughable now. Think about us protecting those jobs 200 years from now. That would just seem laughable. So very unfortunate for those folks, but I have seen studies that indicate that people who lost those jobs, yes, there are definitely deaths of despair, but there also are individuals who are able to get even more higher paying jobs. This is called creative destruction, and it will happen with innovation within a country or with global free trade. So this is definitely one of the shortcomings of this, but my question to you is it incumbent upon the US government to determine these jobs need to be protected at the expense of the innovation that could be created with those individuals and that capital, and also at the expense of the American consumer?
Brief 1 minute rebuttal, and then we gotta get...
One minute. Julia keeps saying, imagine if we had protected those jobs 200 years ago, and she weaves a free market fantasy from a few statements by Adam Smith or David Ricardo. In reality, in 1791, Alexander Hamilton proposed tariffs for all important American manufacturing industries. In 1816, the government of James Madison followed that policy and imposed tariffs on virtually every manufactured goods. We maintained tariffs from 1816 right through to 1945. That was the period when America overtook Britain, who'd opted for free trade in their stupidity, and we became the richest country in the world. Why? Because we were protecting steel, textiles, rails, what else? Guns, partly because James Madison made the realization that, hey, we can't go to war with Great Britain if we're going to be buying guns from Great Britain. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Well, that worked great for us. So I think that, we mustn't allow our view of our own history to be distorted by economics professors who selectively choose phrases out of old dusty books.
Couldn't agree more, Jeff. I don't want us to be thwarted by just some interesting relevant facts or irrelevant facts, but very difficult to prove the counterfactual. And my argument would be that America would have grown even faster and more robustly if we didn't have those tariffs.
Last question, sir.
Thanks for coming. So this has come up a couple of times tonight, about the GDP. So my question is, what do you make of, since that's the primary thing used to measure countries' success or growth, what do you make of other economic indicators such as inequality or rising incomes, or even non-economic factors for looking at a country's success, such as birth rates or lifespans or things like that?
Marriage rates, stuff like that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, or either one, I guess.
So thank you very much for your question. And I apologize if GDP has been misunderstood as something that is what we should be striving for. The world is not a univariate analysis. To your point, we need to be looking at a vast array of things. What does GDP measure? It is an extremely blunt instrument that measures output, and that's it. It does not measure a lot of other things that are really beneficial to us, namely free goods, free time, and the quality of products. So GDP does not measure something that has been extremely robust and helpful to us as American consumers, meaning free time. Americans, by their revealed preference, are showing that they are entering the workplace later, they are leaving it earlier, they are taking more time for leisure. The work week used to be 40 hours, now in some estimates it's 32 hours. That is not captured in GDP. Another thing that's not captured in GDP is a lot of free goods. We call them zero price goods in economics. These are going to be goods, think about Facebook, think about Instagram, think about TikTok, think about Googling something. This also is not captured in GDP. And also, another thing that's not captured in GDP is product quality. In 2007, you could purchase an iPhone for $500. Today, you can also purchase an iPhone for $500, but those two iPhones are extremely, extremely different. So GDP is literally the most blunt instrument. Very serious economists will measure wealth not on output, but on consumption, because that passes the profit and loss mechanism test, saying, do we want to do this? Well, actually, it was more of testing the wind there. Do we want to do this or not? So GDP, I hate to leave you with the fact that that was what we were trying to strive for. It is absolutely not. And to your point, we do need to be taking into account the entire economy.
Last response, then we'll move to closing statements.
Well, I certainly agree that there are lots of social measures that we need to take into account, and the rising number of deaths from drugs, the declining marriage rate. These are all things that make me unhappy with the way America has evolved in the last 40 or 50 years, and I think we'd like the government, and not just the government, but all the people who create and lead opinion in this country to be more cognizant of those social values. As an economist, my main interest is how can we improve the state of the economy, and GDP is one measure. As you said, inequality is very important, equally important. So I think when I think of the economy, my goal is that the wage of the median worker should constantly rise over time, because if that happens, that enables those other things. That enables him or her to get married and have children. That enables him or her to have hobbies, to go to museums. You know, we see that in eras of prosperity, the Renaissance happened not because Michelangelo woke up one morning and said, I'll paint the ceiling. It happened because Renaissance Italy had the number one and two industries of the time, banking and wool, and the magnates who ran those industries were able to fund Michelangelo and Raphael and all the others. And I'd like to see the same thing happening here, and it did sort of happen 50 or 100 years ago, and it's not happening as much today. Thank you.
2-minute closing statements, affirmative first, then negative. Actually, maybe we should flip it. We'll go negative because we started with the affirmative first. So we'll go negative first and then affirmative.
Okay, 2 minutes, So I guess, you know, as you can tell, my view is much more historical than Julia's, which I think it's fair to say is more theoretical, if you'd accept that term. So I want to
Or realistic, we could also say that term.
You may think
Closing
so.
statements, no rebuttals
Okay,
internally.
so I want to leave you with this thought because I think many of you know a little bit about history. I lived in Britain for a number of years, and I was very affected by the decline of the British economy and society and everything else. Britain invented free trade, first with David Ricardo, and then when the free trade laws were passed in the 1840s. What people don't know is that Britain spent 300 years building a protectionist wall around England and Scotland. It began under Henry VII in 1485. He said, they have a textile industry in France. I want that textile industry in my country. And so he built that protectionist wall, no longer exporting virgin wool. We're going to dye it here and turn it into clothing here. We're going to ban Ireland from making clothing because we want to force them to buy British clothing. We're going to ban the American colonies, but those bastards went to war, and the British lost out. We're going to ban India from making calicos, which is the key event that enabled the British textile revolution. And that enabled Britain to become the richest nation in the world by about 1850. In 1846, they opted for free trade. So in 1870, the U.S. surpassed them in wealth because the U.S. had tariffs, and 20 years later, Germany began to surpass them because Germany also had tariffs. So Britain enjoyed 300 years of world-leading prosperity thanks to a protectionist pro-textile policy. It went for free trade for diluted reasons, which we don't have time to go into. In 1846, its leadership in the world began to crumble in 1870. In October 1956, the British Empire collapsed because they invaded the Suez, and President Eisenhower said, I'm not funding you guys to go and wage a colonial war in Egypt. And Britain abandoned that war and began selling off all of its colonies and all the rest. The United States became the world's #1 power. You can guess where I'm going to go with this. Became the world's #1 power thanks to the protectionist policies. which began with Alexander Hamilton and were carried through right up to 1945. We were so drunk on our own world supremacy that we went for free trade in 1945. For the first 30 years, it worked great. After that, other nations began to overtake us, just like we overtook Britain and laughed in 1956. You know, you're not going to invade Suez because you need loans from us. Well, right now, we in the United States owe the rest of the world about $16 trillion. And every year, we increase that debt by $1 trillion. If we want to be the control of our own, the masters of our own fate, we need to fix that situation.
Closing statement.
My wonderful opponent, unfortunately, has confused correlation with causation. It was absolutely not the protectionism of the historical instances that he cites that led to and were the reason for this wealth. And in fact, we have two instances to look at of how protectionism was effective. China before the late 70s and Cuba. Those were arguably extremely protectionist. So if what Jeff is advocating for is actually true, Cuba would be booming and doing extremely well. China before the late 70s also would be booming and doing extremely well. So it was in spite of those protectionist barriers that those economies did well. You need to look at this as a multivariate analysis, and my examples of China and Cuba demonstrate instances where you do have this ultimate protectionism, and if that was the silver bullet, those economies would be prosperous. Something that I also want to note is we very much did not become wealthy because of protectionism. We are wealthy here in the United States because of freedom. Freedom to use our dollar where we want to, and civil freedoms. I want you to ask yourself, and Jeff has been preying upon many fears that you might have. Fears of China, fears of trade deficits, fears of doom and gloom, which you might have. I grant you, you might have those. But I want you to ask yourself, are those a result of free trade? I would be willing to bet many of your fears have little to nothing to do with free trade. And in fact, your purchase at the Walmart or the CVS, as unflashy and amazing as they can be, actually make our lives better. Also, I would like you to leave you with the fact that it is inescapable to have any of these type of government policies without the intervention of bureaucrats. That is just something that will happen, absolutely, and it is impossible to disentangle this political discretion with the incentives of cronyism. Now, I very much hope that I have turned your opinion to more pro-free trade, and with that, that means pro your own decisions. I want you to know that I individually, and as a professional economist, respect your decisions to purchase anything from anybody who you would like at any price, something that my opponent does not agree with. Thank you very much.